Welcome to this APA webinar. If it's your first time, then lovely to have you here. And if not, then welcome back. I host this webinar along with my colleague, Louise Lee. We'd like to make this interactive, so feel free to place questions in the chat box and we'll attempt to discuss them as we go on. Performing arts and academies are really unique and brilliant environments for anyone who loves the art. However, with most things around us, they've changed quite significantly over the last year. And some of these changes have been temporary fixes, but we think that some of these are likely to have ramifications into the future. So in our previous webinars, we've discussed how COVID-19 has changed how we teach. Obviously, the shift online has been one of the biggest things, but actually as staff and faculty have started to reflect on how they teach and learn, then these insights are likely to have longer term ramifications beyond the pandemic. Similarly, particularly in our last webinar, which is actually available on the APA website if you missed it, we looked at how things might be changing in terms of what we teach. And our conversation actually contemplated how art forms themselves are changing, and also started to touch on things like curriculum and how we might have to adapt them if our graduates are going to be successful into the future. And I guess these changes fit into a wider context, that of the changing nature of academies and conservatoires. Some of these academies and conservatoires have traditionally viewed their roles as cultural guardians or gatekeepers of quality. However, over the last decade or so, there's been a growing awareness that the arts and cultural industries are changing quickly, and this position's been weakening. But despite this, some have been satisfied just to kind of bury their heads in the sand as the sea's been leaving the beach. And now all of a sudden the sea's returned to shore as a tsunami. And we're recognizing that academies are going to be forced to change, which raises the questions, well, in what ways are they going to change? And that's what we're going to discuss today. And we're really lucky to have some great speakers on board to help us do this.
And joining us today, we have Professor David Shirley, Executive Dean and Director at the Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts, Edith Cowan University, Australia, and Dr. Joshua Abrams, Vice Dean and Director of Teaching and Learning at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, London, UK. And also Professor Gillian Choa, Deputy Director Provost and Director Designate at the Hong Kong Academy for the Performing Arts. In terms of the structure of the webinar today, our speakers will start with a brief introduction on the topic of the future of performing arts education. And following the discussions, we will be taking questions from the audience. And we also have some questions that are presented to us before the webinar as well that we'll bring to the speakers. So during the webinar, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll be monitoring the chat as well. So without further delay, I'm going to pass the mic to our first speaker, Professor Shirley. David.
Great. Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you very much indeed for that. And thank you also to the Hong Kong Academy for inviting me to take part today. Yeah, my name is David Shirley. I'm the Executive Dean of the Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts, which has been going for 40 years based in Western Australia. It's an academy that hosts training for acting, Bachelor of Performing Arts, dance, classical and contemporary dance, music, classical and jazz, as well as stage management, costume design, props making, all of the kind of usual things that you would expect within performing arts. So we're a multidisciplinary, long established, much loved academy in Australia, and I'm very proud to be holding this post. That being said, inevitably, COVID-19 has presented us, like other conservatoires across the world, with very significant challenges. And I don't mind saying that at the very beginning of the crisis, it threw us into a state of panic because we were thinking, oh my goodness, how do we move all of this training online? And that we did so in 3 weeks with huge urgency and great creativity. I'm hugely proud of all the students and the staff at the Academy for being able to achieve that. If you'd have asked us a month before, say for every time there's a review, how much can you do online? There's always a system where we say, well, we can't, this is all embodied live training that has to take place in the studio. So the fact that we were able to do it in such a kind of considered and organized and creative way is something quite remarkable. That being said, if we just forget, laying COVID-19 to one side for a moment, if we just look at the state of the world that we live in at the moment, where there is, certainly speaking from Australia and certain parts of America, there are fires and people being made homeless. There's parts of the world that are drowning as a result of global warming. There are other parts of the world where people are starving and in poverty. There's mass migration across the continent. Europe is in a state of crisis. America is traumatized. Australian-Chinese relationships are kind of traumatized. There's lots and lots of angst and anxiety. The world is in a sorry, sorry state. And add to that Black Lives Matter and concerns about safety and Me Too. And we absolutely have to see that if conservatoires are going to be representational, if the arts that we train for are going to be representational of the communities of which we are a part, then we cannot continue in the way that we have done traditionally in the past, in a kind of perhaps 19th century sort of model. We have to think about ways of empowering future generations of practitioners going forward. And I would say that what COVID-19 has done, and we're not finished with it yet, is it's opened up a new perspective on which to begin to think about performer training, genuine performer training that is suited to the demands of the 21st century working environment. With all that that entails, what is the function of narrative? How do we tell stories across the world? And who are those stories created by and who for? So there's a much greater sense of inclusivity and involvement across all of the people that we want to train. And I know that all of the schools are going through this. So I suppose the place where I would leave it is that for us, from my point of view, COVID-19 is a pandemic, it's a crisis. But through that crisis, it's teaching us about the areas that we need to think about differently going forward, not because of a pandemic, actually, but because we need to respond to the world and the demands that the world is placing on our performers and all the people that we're training going forward. And that's where we need to open out. So in other words, the pandemic has forced us to think about something that we should have been thinking about maybe 15 or 20 years ago.
Brilliant. Thank you, David, for that fantastic introduction. And it really does help to open up the types of topics we're going to be discussing further. I'd like to hand over to Josh now, who's from the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in the UK. Josh.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Louise. And thank you to the Hong Kong Academy of Performing Arts for inviting me today. Actually, I think that opens up really nicely to where I wanted to start. I wanted to start by acknowledging that actually today, December 1st, is World AIDS Day, which for a long time in the US and in other places globally has been recognized as a day without art, which I think is a really interesting thing to think about this morning, that the devastation that pandemic wrought on the arts industries and creative industries in particular meant that one of the ways of marking it, of celebrating it, was to stop producing art. And a number of museums and performance venues and such have engaged with that for over 30 years at this point, I think, which is a pretty stunning legacy. And I think David ended with a point that's really valuable to me, and one of the places that I want to start, that these aren't changes that are new. And thinking about previous pandemics, whether it's AIDS or the Spanish flu of the 1918-19, or even going back historically to things like the Black Death throughout Europe in the medieval era multiple times, these didn't necessarily create a new normal. They just accelerated change that was already ongoing. And I think that these are the things that we need to recognize, that reports of the theater's death have been ongoing for thousands of years. It's still dying slowly. Now, thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people are dying as well, and that affecting it. But what it's not doing is necessarily changing the fundamentals of people's desire for art, people's desire for content. And I think that's been a stunning thing to me in this pandemic, as we've been locked away in our own cubbyholes, living rooms, lounges, whatever they may be, that the amount of content that has proliferated and the desire for people to watch that, to have access to the arts, is truly astounding. How quickly not just academies have responded, but professional performance venues, museums, the living in London, living in global cities, we have access often to, we're spoiled by the access we have to art on a daily basis. And I think actually we've seen a democratization of some of that possibility over these past 8 months, because I don't need to live in London to have access to the National Theatre Live is one simple example, but to the plethora of small experimental performance work that's now happening online. A company like Creation Theatre out of the UK, who have really expanded rapidly into those online spaces, and I think that's been amazing. In our response, in Central's response to this, I think the first thing to think about was that we're an organization, an institution based in theater, based in collaboration, like so many others. And I think that was where we started. In fact, I think Gillian was at Central in February, and about 2 weeks later, as we saw that we were going to be quickly going into lockdown, I reached out to her and to other people who were already experiencing it, saying what worked, what didn't work. And those responses really helped to shape our chances and our questions. And as well as being the Vice Dean and Director of Learning and Teaching at Central, I'm the current president of the Association for Theatre and Higher Education. One of the things that we've done through that organization is to coordinate a group of about 20 global organizations devoted to theater, performance, dance, related industries in higher education, practice, and teaching of. And through that, we've been really sort of sharing information, and through those organizations, really trying to share information and to ensure that we support the institutions that are there. It seems to me, as David said, that we're not seeing a decline in the interest or in the desire, and we are seeing a question of how do we shift, how do we recognize that our students will continue to be creating live theater, whatever live might mean, as well as the acceleration of gaming, VR, AR technologies that have been there. Yes, we're all based in notions of learning by doing and engagement on the ground, and some things may work better that way, some things we've discovered recently that some things don't. And the challenge that has forced us to rethink how we teach things, has really encouraged us to think about everything from the ground up. And I think those questions are the questions we need to ask. I'm going to stop there and turn over to discussion.
Okay, thank you, Josh. And for participants who just joined us, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and then we will bring them to our speakers later. So now we're moving on to our third speaker, Gillian.
It's very interesting listening to both David and Josh. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of thinking which are in common, I'm sure, among all of us who's been experiencing this very interesting phenomenon of the COVID. I remember back in February when I visited UK, I visited and I was already wearing a mask on the plane when many people didn't. I got to London and nobody was wearing a mask. Nobody knew anything about it. I went to Boots and there were no sanitizers, there were no masks, there were nothing. And I was wondering, now who's actually buying up all these things? And I was getting orders from friends in Hong Kong for toilet paper and sanitizers and God knows what, because there's a crazy run of all these things in the supermarkets here with everybody panicking. But I think at that time, which it seems very long ago, we were going from bewilderment to panic. I think particularly, thinking, what are we going to do with this semester? So it was week to week at the time, thinking, what are we going to do next? Are we going online? Are we closing campus, etc.? And we actually made a decision at the time. And for those of you who haven't been in the our previous webinars, I will have a bit of history here. We actually decided, all of us together, that we are going to just put everything online that we could at the time. So, which means we weren't going to do productions. We were thinking, well, how are we going to teach practice? Is it possible? nevertheless, every school was looking into what can go online and what can't, and saving those, hopefully, you know, in a few months, we would be able to sort of start face-to-face again. So that was the concept at the beginning. So the online courses actually started, I think, around end of March, and we carried on until about mid-May, and we decided to break at that point for 2 weeks. And then in June, we would start face-to-face classes. What happened was we were spot on about June, that we were able to come back on campus. Everybody could start their face-to-face classes, but then with rehearsals starting and everything, and suddenly in July, we had another wave. So then we had to cancel all our productions. So the problem with that is all our final year students, particularly, many of them, I would say, were not able to finish their final year because there were still many of the practical credits, production credits, that they were not able to complete. So we were left, and at that point around August, then we were deciding what are we going to do. So all of us actually came together and decided that we're going to start the semester late in October and also plan the entire academic year around COVID. So in fact, from October, everybody who came back actually knew that there's a timetable that we can flip. So we are not going to go from week to week or month to month. We know the whole semester or even 2 semesters what's going to happen. Anytime that we have another wave like now, then we will decide, okay, we're going to flip it back to online. So this is what we've been doing. So we're not wondering anymore. So it seems that over how many months now? 9 months, 10 months, we've actually learned quite a lot very quickly. And I think what's interesting is like what both David and Josh have said, that we have learned a lot in terms of what COVID has brought us. In fact, I also see that even though it's a pandemic, it's opened up a lot of spaces for us when it comes to teaching and learning. Something that we have never thought about. In fact, I would say that maybe only a year or so ago, many of our teachers were very skeptical about online classes. Performing arts simply cannot be taught online in any way. Or maybe, liberal arts, maybe complementary studies, languages, we can do it, but oh no, not my subject, not my discipline. But now everybody has really changed their minds. And what's interesting, it's what's coming next, is that many of our teachers are already thinking whether they will retain some of these online classes or blended courses. And as we are looking into, or we have been working on a curriculum review for launch in 2022. So everybody is already thinking for that curriculum, are we going to revert back to the traditional? Are we going to revert back to where we were when, okay, we don't need online courses? No, everybody is actually thinking of a new approach to teaching and learning. And everybody is embracing it, which is phenomenal, because we've worked for years to get people to think this way, and only within months, because of what has happened, that they're pushed into thinking about the online approach, the online mode, that people are really embracing the change. And so with performing arts, with our practice, of course, we prefer to be able to perform on stage, but at the same time, there are now possibilities open where we can really think about, accessing a performance online. So we are building, in fact, a completely new audience, I believe. people who do not normally go to theater, and now suddenly they're introduced to something quite different, and they're probably going to continue. Where the theaters or the companies, the performing companies are concerned, they are also thinking about a new way of producing work online. And in future now we see a lot of free access to performances. I'm sure when we go back to normal, maybe those will continue, but maybe you will buy tickets for an online performance, etc. So it's a new, it's actually a new way to approach performance commercially as well. And for performers, again, you perform online is quite different from performing on the stage. Just like years ago, when the Metropolitan Opera started, sort of what do you call it, the Met Opera, which is basically again live streamed as well as recorded for the rest of the world to see. Suddenly the performer has to think about those close-ups. It's not just the performer, but the sets, the costumes, etc. Suddenly we are seeing detail like we are in the film, and it's no longer about distance. So the approach to performance, approach to selling performance, approach to learning performing arts has changed completely, particularly within this year. So I'm very positive about what's coming in the future. And it's because of something very negative that we've come up with something very positive.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gigi, for that. It seems that actually through this initial discussion, we've really started to pin down some very practical things that have been happening, but also some wider trends that are actually really affecting things. And I'd like to pick up on this with the first question. And it's a question which we were asked by Catherine Mazier. And she asked, how has online teaching and training diversified and internationalized your students, faculty, or course content? I'm guessing some of this has happened already, but some might be things that are going to happen over the next 5 or 10 years. And I guess I'd quite like to pick up, I think it's something that Josh said about this cross-institutional working, perhaps frameworks to enable students to move between institutions to personalize their learning, and creating these sort of pathways through institutions working more closely. So I don't know if there's something there which we could pick up on, perhaps.
Actually, it's quite interesting because just very recently, a few weeks ago, I was starting to explore. There's an institution, in Hong Kong, and also several institutions around the world. This has joined together to work on virtual exchange. So this is something that I don't think anybody really thought about before, but because now we are so comfortable with delivering courses online, etc. This is actually fantastic. Just as we are now today in this webinar. Last year we would be looking at flights flying to London, or to Australia, or to Hong Kong in order to get together for this kind of discussion. But it's I think people are now very comfortable about doing everything online. So I think I can see that it really opens up the idea of virtual everything, virtual exchange, virtual courses that we can actually teach. Maybe someone from Hong Kong can be teaching someone in New York or wherever around the world. And the possibility is open. I think there's an explosion of possibilities because of what can be accessed online.
Absolutely. I'd wholly echo that. I think one of the things that we saw right away is that our staff base we have a large number of visiting lecturers, and those are almost always limited. Those are largely people in the profession, in industry, who are able to come in and speak to students about live experiences that they're having. And that's always limited by people who are in London. We rarely can bring people to London for a one-off session or even a two-week kind of session along those lines. And actually, across our provision, we've been able over the past 8 months to have people teaching from all over the world. and that's been astounding. Really, the student benefit in that has been really incredible. And I know I've had some preliminary conversations with people, not just about virtual exchange possibilities, but also about courses taught synchronously between two institutions. So where you might have the students collaborating between it might be that design students from Hong Kong Academy of Performing Arts are working with our design students on a collaborative project, and really able to do that through this kind of space, which I think is a stunning possibility. And then the other possibility, I think the other end of that too, is about placement for our students, for all of our students. And one of the challenges that I think we all face with international students is how we acclimatize them, or how we embed them in their home countries, how we help them in the same way that we can help domestic students with industry placements or agents for performers. And I think the changes that we're seeing there are stunning. The first streamed production that we did, which was our MA Music Theater, sorry. Normally in our theater space, in the 250 seat space, we would do 4 performances. The number of live views it received was equivalent to selling out that space 70 times. So those students had a global impact and had possibilities of agents and all sorts of things globally that they never would have had.
Good. Just to echo everything that Gillian and Josh said, I would say that at WAPA, we've always had a dependence, because of our location in Western Australia, we're quite isolated in Perth, we've had a dependence on visiting artists, and we have lots and lots of philanthropic resources to bring over visiting artists. Because of this pandemic, we were forced to think creatively about that. There's 2 things I would say. First of all, the students taught us a lot about it. We have a fantastic piece of music that was created. I sent a challenge out to our classical music students saying, what can you share with all the people that are supporters of WAPA and our audiences during this pandemic period? And they came up with a wonderful piece of music called Brave the Wave. And it features almost kind of 50 or 60 classical music students who created a stunning original piece of music composed by one of our students, but they did it all themselves without tutorial support on their mobile phones. And this piece, which I'm happy to share with the panel afterwards, is absolutely stunning. It's had something like 25,000 views across the world. It's hugely, hugely creative. But actually it was the students that did it, and they did it all through their mobile phones. So in terms of leading the way digitally, they have much that they can teach all of us. The other thing is, again, in music, we've had opportunities where, jazz musicians in New York have been giving one-to-one tutorials to jazz musician students here at WAPA. And that's something that we perhaps may not have thought about, but the pandemic made necessary. I'm working with Cheek by Jowl, so that in January, Declan Donnell is going to be talking to our students in a Zoom session. Again, it's an experience that they wouldn't have, and that he will talk about his work. They will have an opportunity to talk to him. So in that sense, I actually think there's a wealth of opportunities that students can benefit from. I think the thing that we've got to be, without wanting to appear conservative, because I know that this is a big concern, there's something about people gathering together in a space to witness something. And also, I actually think practitioners coming together in a space to be in the same space as each other, reading each other, the sense of reciprocity that goes into that, and just picking up in terms of what Gillian was saying about the digital space and appearing on the digital space, the kind of, although we might want to refine the levels of gesture and facial expression, etc., there is something about training that needs to communicate that skill in an embodied way to future generations of practitioners. So I think whilst there is a gateway in the digital opportunity for the future that we all need to be brave and enter into, we mustn't forget the benefits of live studio-based training, where students learn about themselves and learn about others, and how to be to reciprocate with each other, and how to be part of an ensemble of storytellers or music creators or whatever it might be. So I think that's going to be the challenge, because we don't want to be conservative, but we also need to make sure that we train in a way that is empowering and enabling of a craft.
Thank you, David. So picking up from your point about, we're learning a lot from our students. I have a question here from Carol Johnson. So the question is, what will be a likely strategy to implement to support teaching staff with these changes? Do we need to ensure practitioner teachers have pedagogical training in order that the quality of the instruction remains constant across the classroom, the studio, and the internet?
Yeah, a really good question. So I actually think it is incumbent upon all of us to make sure that the staff that we employ to deliver our training are able to speak the same language as the students that they are working with, and use all the methodologies and all the means. Otherwise, they risk becoming antiquated and old-fashioned and being dismissed on that basis. So there's absolutely no reason why we can't hold on to the important traditions, but filter those through the means by which contemporary students engage with the world and understand the world, and therefore they need to be familiar with online technologies, different ways of engaging with digital media, etc., so that they can rethink their creativity. If you actually think before film and television, before those things happen, the conception of an actor or a theatre maker would largely have been in a live space or in an open air, etc. And then, of course, film comes along and everybody's really scared of it. And then you first of all get your silent movies, then you get your talkies, then you get TV. Those are massive shifts in our understanding of our art forms. And we're not at that place now. We've been at that place a long time. I remember talking about multimedia performance 25 years ago. We're there and we've got to step into it, but we've got to make sure that our staff have the tools to be able to engage with our students, unpack, not just simply in terms of comprehension, but to be creative with those technologies and those understandings, so that we create new worlds and new pieces of work that speak to the world of which we're all a part, but most particularly the students that we're working with.
Yeah, I'd echo everything that David said there, and say that I don't know that it's pedagogical training. Some of it is, but I think a lot of it for me is about collaboration across staff, encouraging the people to think creatively and ensuring that they have the time and the space to rethink the type of work that they're doing. I think that's really fundamental. We think about conservatoires and the root of conserve to save, and there is a saving that's necessary in this, but there's also in that the space for invention that comes out of knowing the material so well, understanding it. And today the range of what you need to know is drastically different. These changes have been happening, as David says, but people need to know the tools. They need a facility with the tools. They need the time to experiment and to think and to see what other people are doing with it and to build their own ideas from it.
You're on mute.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think all the there's so many dings when I got emails, so I thought I switched off. Yes, all the different things we've learned in the past few months about digital delivery, of courses, of performance, etc. I think this will, this certainly, we really have to get into making sure teachers as well as students are aware of the difference between the physical delivery and the digital delivery. So this is something to be learned as well. Of course, we're pushed into experiencing it, and we've learned a lot from it. But it's about organizing all those, all the experience, the thoughts, etc., and see how we then make use of it and make sure people really understand the difference. And when you design your curriculum, etc., you've got to be aware that being in a classroom and being in a digital classroom and a physical classroom are very different. So you can't actually just switch a course, as it is online and be successful with it. As we did a little bit at the beginning, back in maybe February or March, and students are going to tell you, look, it's not working, it's boring, I don't know what's going on. So we've learned through our experience, and we need to collect all that experience from each other, indeed, you know, from around the world, and see what it means to deliver it differently, and the approach, an approach that we can actually learn from each other and also teach it to new teachers, and explain to students how to actually learn through the different modes.
Great, thank you everyone. I'd like to move on to a question by Brian Watkins, who's actually a member of staff at T in APA. He asks, how could project-based learning be incorporated into a teaching schedule going forward? And to broaden that out, the wider context is that our School of T have adapted their timetable due to this, and all of a sudden they're finding project-based learning being quite a useful way to deliver their curriculum. And so I guess, I mean, are the other schools thinking about how they restructure their scheduling, and particularly with blended learning, how that might work, really? Yeah, Josh.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this has been fundamental. I keep coming back to collaboration, and so much of our work is based on collaboration between courses. And so really, we've done one of the challenges of rethinking the timetable in this year, where we've been moved from fully online in the spring to this academic year where we're about 35% in person and 65% not. And thinking about how that works has absolutely meant that thinking about project-driven learning, where students are on site for maybe a week together in a bubble, working, you know, intensely, and some of the outcomes of that have been phenomenal. Actually, lots of the outcomes of that have been phenomenal. So I think we're in the process very much of having conversations about how we think about that in relation to the semesterization or timetables, differential timetables that always, you know, if we have student placements within a group, how do those work? How do we build this so that it works for all our students? I have no answer for that yet, for the possibility of that, other than to say that I think it is absolutely someplace we see ourselves going, and trying to figure out how to make it exciting. Well, not how to make it exciting. I think it is really exciting, but how to make it work as the basis for our courses. A couple of our courses have been that previously, but really now it's looking at how that fits across the entire portfolio.
Speaking Western Australia, I mean, we've been extremely fortunate in our journey through the pandemic, because I don't know if you know what's been going on here in WA, but the Premier closed the borders, so you couldn't get in or indeed out of Western Australia, but we were virtually COVID-free, so all of our students were able to come back at the start of semester 2 in July, and they've been here ever since. And we've been doing performances, and we've been bringing in the public to see those performances with a 60% capacity that's taken account of spatial distancing. But in terms of project learning, the strategy that we adopted at the start of it was to try to front load. Initially, there was the traditional separation between the theoretical, which you can do online, and the practical, which you can do in the studio. So that was the approach that we took initially as a means of solving the problem. And it worked very well in terms of putting up, you know, bringing forward some of the theoretical work that students might have been doing in semester 2, for example, putting it into semester 1. And then what we did across the school, we put in place from July a 6-week full day of practice for all courses. So whereas very often we would blend rehearsals and classes, we actually put practice in place for everything, so that students were catching up on the practical elements, voice, movement, musicianship, etc., dance, etc., with all of their practices before they then went into rehearsals for productions, which normally we would do here, half-day classes, half-day rehearsal. They went into full-time rehearsals. Now, in terms of solving the problem for the pandemic, that's proved very exhausting for everybody, but very productive in terms of the student experience. We're having to graduate our third years a bit later than we would normally do, but they will have had, albeit a truncated and intense training, they will have had it. What it's taught us in terms of how we might conceive of our curricula going forward and undertake reviews is to work out those spaces where we can actually be a bit more creative with practice. So, for example, I taught a first-year acting class based on Uta Hagen's object exercise classes where students were actually during the pandemic, when they were all over the country, over in Sydney and Melbourne, and we were able to deliver that work. And that threw up really interesting practical problems, because although it was great because they didn't have to bring all their furnishings into a Whopper studio, they were already in the locations. In terms of fine-tuning the imaginative engagement, that sort of stopped, because they didn't need to endow a space with being about it. They were actually in the space. So that creates a slightly different problem, but that's a really creative problem to solve, because then we think, okay, so how do we engage the imagination? And it's made us think about ways of delivering practice, let's say in an acting space, that is going to force us to be more creative and ingenious in the way we think about it. I'm told by my music colleagues that the digital space is actually not too difficult for them to work in. There's lots that they can do inside the digital space. Of course, when the orchestra needs to come together, they do need to have that opportunity, but there's lots of one-to-one musicianship that works really, really well. So we are really open to thinking about our curricula in the future, having much more project-led driven assignments, where students, because very often it's more convenient for students as well, it makes their lives much more easy and more efficient, and it gives them a way of engaging with their training that's not so slavishly dependent on a kind of 12-hour day timetable that has to be inside a particular studio space. It also frees up our timetable in the spaces so that we can use it creatively. So we, like Josh, we haven't quite solved all the problems yet, but we're on the road to really thinking about those in a much more dynamic way than we were, say, 12 months ago.
Thank you. I think you have actually answered some of the questions that that I plan to answer, that I plan to ask you, because we actually have a lot of questions in the chat box. So I'm going to try to kind of group 3 questions together relating to the topic that you just mentioned, David. So the first question here is your institutions of many disciplines, which area responded more successfully to the transition to online teaching, and what methods did they employ? And also we have a question from a lecturer in the School of Theatre and Entertainment Arts. How can we encourage new students to study theatre crafts, and how can the practical skills be taught away from the workshop? And then one final question is about video recordings. So we have one participant, he or she has participated in a lot of MOOC courses on Coursera. So the participant was wondering whether universities should produce video recordings to deliver teaching instead of relying solely on teaching live online. So 3 questions all at once.
Okay, blimey. Yeah, shall I kick off a little bit, first of all? So just in terms of the universities delivering through video online, it's really, I mean, I think there will be a move for lots of university institutions across different academic subjects to look at this as a possibility. That being said, my daughter is a first-year student doing business studies, and she, a lot of it was delivered online, and it's kind of lecture-based delivery, quite traditional lecture-based delivery, and she found that delivery quite tedious and quite exhausting. She was really relieved in a business studies program to be able to go back into the lecture theatre and meet and talk with other students. So there's something about learning that is interactive, and I don't mean interactive in a digital way, I mean interactive about sitting in the cafe saying, what did that mean? I didn't understand. Can you explain it to me? And I think that sense of community is really, really important. In terms of Whopper, I would say that perhaps one of the most successful, I mean, within the Edith Cowan University, of which Whopper is a part, there are, you know, it's a big university. It's got over 30,000 students. They did a pulse survey halfway through COVID to see how the students were responding. I couldn't believe it. None of us could believe it. Whopper came out tops from having this initial panic thinking, how are we going to respond to this? our students responded really favorably to the extent to which we were able to adapt. And my sense of that is to do with the creativity of the staff and students in responding to this particular crisis. So we did really well. But the one area that did exceptionally well, I think, was music. And for them, the transition was not as extreme as it was for, let's say, for acting or music theatre or ballet, for example, where there really is a kind of challenge in that sort of area. Music have done very well and will be carrying forward a lot of that practice and that experience as they develop the course. And I think a lot of that is to do with the one-to-one tuition that goes on and a lot of the practice-based, tutorial-based work that goes on in a music conservatorium. So from that point of view, it was very, very good. If I can just turn to the question about how we're going to attract more theatre students, I think that was the question that we were being asked. My response to that would be sorry, is that, can you hear that? Is that my phone going? Sorry, it will stop in a moment. Stop it. It's stopped. There we go. So for me, of course, the move into, when we start to think about theatre and adapting to a digital space, you know, the question does come arise. So how are students going to be attracted to this in the future? My sense is, I think as somebody said earlier in this program, theatre has been dying for thousands of years. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of the longest death in history. It's never going to, we're always going to need it. We're always going to need to come to a place together to understand human nature and the human predicament, and therefore it's very alive. We're never, ever going to stop that. And different forms of theatre, opera and dance and ballet and all the rest of it. So I actually think there is a cathartic, communal experience that you don't get in a Zoom space. So many people that I have known, despite all the discoveries that they've made through Zoom spaces and digital spaces, they come away thinking, oh my God, I'm so exhausted. I've had so many things, in a way that it's not as regenerative as a kind of live theatrical pieces. So I do think we need to protect the kind of authenticity of that theatrical experience. But I don't think we're going to have to work too hard to protect it. I think the audiences will demand it of us. And I think there's always going to be a demand for it. And I think there'll always be students interested in it. I think generations of students in the future will shift their understanding of what that theatre space is. And I think there is, you know, if we look at the Katie Mitchell work, for example, you know, live film type work, there's all sorts of ways that we can reinvigorate it and think about it differently. But I think there is something wonderfully authentic about live performance in a space where we're all together witnessing something that we're never going to lose.
Hear, hear. Yeah, to pick up on that, and I can't answer the first question explicitly. I mean, in a way, saying which of them is best is like asking, you know, a parent to pick their favorite child, I think. But I think, because I think the creativity that David's talking about is clear across our courses, and everybody has had different successes in things. I think the thing I would point to perhaps as the strongest, the most surprising success for us has been the way that splitting cohorts into 2 or 3 groups and having a smaller group within the space, but that the rest of the cohort is watching stuff live streamed, has actually produced an intensity for the students and the staff in the space that they're feeling is really incredibly productive in a different way. So if you have a group of 18 normally in a space doing exercises, doing some form of whether it's an acting exercise, voice exercise, other type of work, that actually having, if we have 9 people in the space, the attention that they get from each other is more than twice as effective, a lot of people are finding. And I think that is really interesting. And the people who are then offsite watching that for those 2 days and then come on site on the next 2 days have that experience where they're really gaining from that. And I think that to use one of those corporate speak terms of learning journey, I think that there's a feeling of that as actually being much more productive in a lot of ways amongst many of the staff and students. And for me, the other 2 questions actually I tie up together in a lot of ways about interest and the sort of Coursera type models. Because one of the things that we found is that the things that can be taught incredibly well online, some of which are surprisingly practical things, costume construction, pattern sewing, steps, and some of those things that become that produce a way into thinking about historic costume are suddenly, that we've been able to put online, where we've been able to put some tasters or samples online, are leading to potentials for students being interested in pursuing those degrees where there might not have been something they had known about or had engaged with. And I think the same is true for acting, for content. It is that question about how much the drive for content has continued and how aware people are now, how everybody is spending their time. You know, I saw a post the other day from somebody saying, "I've finished Netflix," which they were intending as a joke, but I thought actually there's something about this, about how much time people are spending in front of screens watching all the content that's there, and that continual drive for new content that I think we probably see doubled down when we can all be in shared spaces regularly with more confidence.
Gigi, you might want to unmute yourself again.
I agree with both David and Josh. I mean, absolutely. I think that not just audiences, but performers would always demand live performances. I don't think that will ever go away. The traditional will always be there. And even with our teaching, you know, we base you know, the foundation of training is usually, you know, we base it on the traditional, and then we, of course, allow our students to then evolve into experimental work and all the creative work that they get into, whether it's the digital space or the physical space. So I think, you know, like I said before, what's happening now, it doesn't matter which discipline. And again, I would agree with Josh, it's very difficult to say which area particularly is more successful. I would say that in the academy here, we've seen some incredible work coming from music, from dance, from drama, from the technical areas of theatre and entertainment arts, and we're continuing to do that. And they're pushing themselves to the limit to try and find ways of experimenting, creating, which we haven't seen a lot before. And I think students are becoming also very independent in the way they're creating as well, because it's become so easy for them to just pick up a phone and shoot a video of themselves, even across to you know, fellow students in China, in mainland China who can't return to Hong Kong, for instance. They're producing work together online. So we're seeing a lot of this kind of activity, but that I think will continue. But certainly the communal experience that David was talking about is so important. You know, chatting to each other about their creative work, you know, brainstorming over a cup of coffee, that sort of thing is so important to all of us, whether it's in the performing arts world or you know, other areas. You know, I think it's working better than we've thought, you know, some months ago, and it's creating a completely new world. There is a new normal, and the new normal is very positive.
Brilliant, thank you, everyone. I think we have time literally for one very short final question, which is the same one I typically ask, which is, if you could sort of just draw this entire conversation down to one point or idea, what would that be? If there was one takeaway that you could offer somebody from this discussion, what might it be? I don't know who's brave enough to go first with that one.
I think it's really looking into global collaboration. I think it's now we are ready. I think all of us has done the work, you know, locally, you know, what we can do for our you know, teaching and learning. Now it's to look at global collaboration, which is, I think it can be quite phenomenal.
I would agree with that, and I would say that the extraordinary challenges of the pandemic, you know, and there have been many of them, if they've done anything for us in our sector, they've highlighted for us how much work we need to do in order to speak to the, not just to the current, but to the future audiences and students and people that we want to train. But what the pandemic has done is it's shone a light, not just on where the gaps are, but how to begin to think about solving those problems as we move forward. It's made us think creatively as a way of going forward.
Yeah, I'd echo both of those. I think that the democratization that becomes possible through pedagogical practices of flipping the classroom that exist in other spaces that don't necessarily exist in our spaces, that global collaboration, that these possibilities allow for to diversify the viewpoints that are coming into our spaces, and to that simultaneously recognize the values of tradition and the possibilities of experimentation. The point that David made about that survey is amazing to me, and I think that we have the creativity in our fields, in our staff, in our students, and it's really about allowing for that to be freer and to really work together. How do we create architectures that allow for those possibilities to just flower?
I agree. Fantastic.
Brilliant. Thank you everyone for helping and speaking. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to David, to Josh, and to Gillian for taking part in this. So thank you very much. Also, thanks to the wider Edu at IT team who've worked on the technical side of this production and putting it together. Whilst this kind of concludes the formal part of the live stream, we're going to keep the chat open for probably about another 30 minutes or so. So if you have any further questions you'd like to post, then that's great. I think some of our speakers are going to stay online. I'm not sure. Gillian, I think you have to leave. So thank you for helping there. Yeah, thank you. So we'll move on to a slightly less formal part in a minute.
Okay, and the recordings of this and previous webinars are all on our website, and I've just shared the link on the chat box, and we'll also be sending you an email. So this concludes this year's webinar series, and we'll be back early next year exploring more topics on performing arts education. So goodbye for now, and stay safe and stay well, and I hope to see you all in 2021. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Gillian. That's really great.
See you soon. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Great. So if you're still online, I can see we have a number of attendees. If you would like to pop anything in the chat, then that would be really good. And we'll see if we can address any of the questions. I think we have some other ones also floating around which we had before. Was there anything which we didn't touch on that you thought we needed to speak about? David and Josh, is there anything where you're like, I really wanted to say this, but didn't get an opportunity?
No, I feel that I feel that we've had a good opportunity, and I'm happy to respond to further questions.
Yeah, I'd agree. Everything that I had in my brief notes I came around to. So
good.
I think the question from Catherine in the chat, from Catherine Mazer, about the difficulty of internet connection and censorship, I think are challenges that we are going to have to figure out. I think there are challenges. I think it was David started by talking about the differential spaces that we're seeing, differential issues we're seeing in different countries at the moment. And I think one of the things that we have seen across much of the world the past few years is a drive towards parochialism in many places, and and the pandemic has played into that in a lot of ways, with that tendency for us all to be, only able to travel within 2 kilometers of our house. The fact that, I haven't been on a plane in 9 months, which is, I don't know, probably, I can't think of the last time I wasn't on a plane once a month. And that has been really shocking to me, to all of us, I know. And I hope that the creativity and the possibilities for collaboration can force some of these questions to really open up. We have at Central, one of the challenges that we had in dealing with censorship and firewall issues was looking at how we could provide students with library access in different places. And so one of the things that we've done with students who have gone back to countries where they have differential access is to partner with institutions there so that they have access to library facilities in their own city, in their own country. Yes, there are challenges, there are ethical questions. Yes, it may be that my staff don't read don't have access to the language in which documents are written from the students are supporting. But I think being able to provide that support and to think about that is a first step. But I think it's absolutely something we're going to need to take on globally. And I think it's probably not something that will come out of the arts, but I think it's something that we can play a major role in the arts because we do collaboration well.
Yes, I agree with that. I think collaboration is something that is absolutely instinctive to all of us. And I agree with the kind of risk around a kind of parochial thing that the pandemic plays into. Here in Western Australia, there's always been a tendency for that, not because Western Australians are parochial, but because we're so isolated. So we've always had to be quite resourceful in the way in which we interact with the rest of the world, and we've set up really good alliances. I also think occasions like this, I mean, I've taken part in a few webinar events such as this, where the community, whilst on the one hand we can't travel, and therefore we remain static in where we are located geographically. I feel I've done a lot of traveling this year in terms of these kind of events, because the community has expanded and I've got to know so many more people in so many other different countries and so many practitioners who care enormously about the work that we're doing. So it's funny, I've been and met more people in this year, and like Josh, I travel a lot, especially since I've been in Australia. But I feel I've met more, and I'm looking forward to actually meeting people in person when we can actually get together and visit each other and do shared projects together that will benefit all of our students, etc. So in that sense, it's been a real positive experience that alliances and partnerships have been established that might have taken 4 or 5 years to get to, given the usual kind of situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Actually, there's a question here which we had by one of the registrants asking about examining and evaluating, how it's changed assessment, which we haven't picked up on. We haven't talked about assessment at all, but I guess that's one of the huge things that's changed.
Sorry, where was that question?
Was that what you said to us before? Yeah, it was a question that somebody posed earlier on when they actually registered. So it was how does COVID-19 change the way of examining and evaluating? I know in APA there have been moments where people had to really rethink their assessments because the traditional assessments they typically use just kind of wouldn't work.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I mean, we've had to shoot from the hip. What we've had to do in delivering the training is make sure that whatever we do in our commitment to the training, and ECU made a statement that no student will be disadvantaged by COVID-19. So in order to solve the problems where students maybe couldn't come into for a live assessment, we looked at the learning outcomes, we got the spirit of what those were, and we adapted the assessments in such a way to enable students to achieve those. In some instances, we've had to rearrange the timetables so that we've moved assessments from one part of the year to the other, because you can't just switch overnight. So we've combined creativity in terms of the interpretation of the learning outcomes together with a timetable planning to enable students to adjust to the changes that we've made in relation to that without losing sight of the ensemble nature of it. So for example, if you take a music assessment, the fact that students may be in isolation, just the very fact that they can create a piece of music that actually they do as an orchestra, but it's online, is a really interesting and innovative way of achieving the learning outcomes. So again, it's about creativity and being adaptable and being flexible. And I think that's what the students tuned into, the creativity of the staff and responding to it, so that they genuinely weren't disadvantaged. The year was turned upside down and rearranged, but the training was delivered. And that, the other side of that is that the staff thought, oh my goodness, I've never thought about it in this way. Why did we not think about this 5 years ago? Or why did we not think about this when this was going for the review? So there is a sense in which it's making us all, you know, COVID-19 threw us into a dark room. And when you're in a dark room, you have to feel your way out of it or find your way to the switch. And that sensation or that metaphor of feeling has made us rediscover all the bits of the room that we were not able to see when the light was on.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really useful metaphor there. We're the three of us are all, or the panel here is all in countries that are where higher education is very bureaucratic, I would say, and very driven by languages of learning outcomes, languages of quality assurance. And I think one of the things that the pandemic has revealed in and around assessment is how quickly we can move when external circumstances force us to. And I think that's actually been incredible, that as David says, that those possibilities of being able to rethink on a given basis and on a bespoke basis, because our students don't all have the same spaces, they don't all have the same kinds of access. So while early on there were incredible resource offers that we were able to take advantage of and that students were able to take advantage of software packages being free or various things that enabled a range of different kinds of engagements, I think what we're seeing as we settle into this is staff and students working together to really be driven by, this is the learning outcome, this is what we normally think the way to assess that would be, but actually there's a world of possibilities, and that possibility for each of the students might have different affordances and different faces in terms of how it happens.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
Can I pick up, I've got a question which I'd like to ask, which picks up on something that David said at the very beginning, which is around, I think I actually wrote it down, I'm not sure if I can find it. It's about who has access to what it is that we make and who's it being made for. And it was along that line. I might have misquoted you, so I'm sorry if I did. But really, I mean, obviously we can see a lot of changes have happened with COVID, but I think this is something that's been potentially a pre-existing problem of academies, and how you think that might shift. What are the things that are going to create that shift? Because for me, that's something quite essential to my work, how we make these places more inclusive.
Yeah. Do you want me to start with that?
If you want to, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean that comment coming from me, you know, is less to do with COVID, actually. I mean, before I came to Australia, I was chair of the Federation of Drama Schools in the UK. And one of the vexing issues for drama schools is around this notion of widening participation, inclusivity, but inclusivity on a level that's not just about, it has to be inclusivity on the terms of the students that want to come and train in our institutions, not on the terms of those that teach. Do you know what I mean? Because if, you know, many of us that teach will say, well, it's really, really important that we do Shakespeare or that we do Ibsen or that we do Chekhov, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, if the students that we are wanting to train, or if they actually want to take part in the training, they need to feel that their cultures and their histories and their relationships and their experiences are represented in the schools that we teach in. And one of the things I learned when I was in Manchester, where we worked very hard to increase inclusivity and diversity, and I'm not saying that we were successful at it at all, it was a lot of work that we had to do. It was just really simple things like, what does the visual imagery look like when somebody walks into a school? Where do they see themselves reflected in that school? On the website materials, on all the publicity and brochure materials? Because, you know, and if you bring students from diverse backgrounds in and then give them the traditional canons that we've all been doing for centuries, what does that, how does that communicate to them about where's the value of their experience or their understanding of the world, and how flexible are we? It feels like we're an armada moving in one direction, and the pandemic has thrown us all into relief. But actually the question is, who is dictating what should be in our curricula, and who is delivering that curricula, and who is that curricula for, or those programs for? And actually I think we've got to go back to basics, because we are living, the world is very different now to the way in which the drama schools were first established at the beginning of the 20th century. It's completely different. But the things that we value in performance haven't shifted that much. The ability to be able to tell stories about your culture and share those stories and learn from those stories and reflect on those stories and think about how those stories might shape future practice, those are universal principles. But there's more than one way to do it, and there's more than one means by which we do it. So I feel, and this was really brought into light during the summer with Black Lives Matter, and actually, so it should be. We have been slow to pick it up. I know, for example, that we were saying 10 years ago we need to decolonize the curricula, but we didn't do it. Why not? Do you know what I mean? It's really important that we do it, and now we're being forced to do it, quite rightly. And I know that Central's very much at the vanguard of those changes and has experienced it in a very particular way, but is really holding itself accountable, and we all need to do that.
Yeah, it is absolutely, fundamental to what we all really need to be doing. And I have little to add to what David said, other than to say we need to listen.
Yeah.
And I was at a meeting last year, because it was a meeting in person, and where someone from a conservatoire actually in 2019 or early 2020 described that the role of the conservatory is to conserve the English language. And I gasped, as did a number of other people in the room. And I think that the question of thinking about that as sort of something that remains in our DNA, as something that somebody could wholly, openly, and honestly and comfortably say, is unconscionable to me. And I think that we need to do work with that. The work that my colleague Darren Oram has been doing on decentering RP as the basis of teaching voice, right? And working across neurodiversity, working across the spectrum of neurodiversity, thinking about how people learn, in listening to not just our students, but listening to the people who are not our students and who can't get over that threshold that David talks about, who look at the website and don't see themselves with us, and use that as a way, and that becomes a barrier. We need to find a way to listen to them, even more importantly than the people who are already our students, I think, or at least as importantly, perhaps. I don't have an answer.
Really good. I could keep on asking questions around that. I won't stop there, but it's for me, I think that's one of our biggest challenges. I almost feel for COVID things being a bit of a blip, but actually there's some really underlying issues that these sorts of institutions really need to deal with.
Yeah,
that's one of them.
Yeah.
There was a point from one of the previous webinars that was in the circulation you sent out about the relinquishing of control, that I think it said online education requires the teacher to relinquish control both over the perception that they're in control and over the student's time. And I think that is something that we're really bad at in the conservatoire sector. We really, especially with the focus on contact time, on contact that our students engage with, and thinking about some of the other challenges that I'm thinking about right now around different kinds of learners are in different kinds of learning journeys and processes. People who have caring responsibilities, who can't give up a 40-hour week to come learn with us, but who want to and deserve to. How do we think about those? How do we open those challenges? Are really important to us, I think.
Yeah, agreed.
Louise, is there anything that you've spotted which?
I think we have covered everything. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you for sharing.
I've just sent the link, the piece of music that I said that all the students did on the phone without ever coming together. I've just shared it with everybody. So, because somebody had asked for it, can you? So I've just sent it out to everybody to have a look at. It's called Brave the Wave.
That's great. Thank you, David. What we'll try to do when we post this video live, we'll post a link to that as well.
Great.
So put that on our website.
Good.
Fabulous. look forward to
I
watching.
think we're probably drawing to a close because we haven't got any questions coming from anyone else.
Okay, well, I just want to say thank you very much for the invitation. I found it really, really stimulating. It's been great talking to you, Josh, Gillian, yourself, Robert, and yourself, Louise, as well. It's been really good. And I think we need to keep having these kinds of events where we keep talking and putting our heads together to look to the future. It's been hugely stimulating. So I'd like to thank everybody.
Absolutely. I could not say it any better. Just thank you to everyone involved and to the attendees as well. I think that spread is fundamental.
Great.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
so much. Bye-bye.